Well, good morning once again. I hope you guys are doing very well. Hope you had a great week so far. I know you're snowed in and everything. I hope you're being safe and but trying to have some fun. This kind of sleet, snow, whatever, this is the best for snowballs and sledding, though falling off could certainly hurt, but it's worth it, right? It's worth it to have a little fun. But I also hope you're getting your work done. So by the end of this week, I will have every audiobook is posted. The reading is posted. I'll have all the videos done too. By the time we come back Monday, you need to have read, listened, and watched everything, and we'll be caught up. We'll be just fine. And so today, I'll pop out the last videos, and this one is the economic primer, 1750 to 1900. So we'll discuss economic systems just briefly. A lot of this we have already talked about in some way, and so I'm not going to hit on a lot or stay there. I'll move on pretty fast as it is a lot to cover. So let's get into it. So the background to the Industrial Revolution. First thing you need to know is 1782, James Watt patents a better working steam engine. This is a model of it right here that uses coal to boil water, and the steam drives a piston, right? And so it does work where we had to use animals or people before. Now we can use machines. And the steam engine is going to be used primarily in like the coal industry and mining to pump out water from the mine shafts because they tend to flood, right? And so they can dig deeper and longer if it's not flooding. And in the textile industry, where it's used to drive machines like the loom and the spinning jenny and stuff like that, that greatly increases cotton production. Why did it start in England first? There's a number of factors, political, geography, stuff like that. First is some uh, decisions by Parliament in the early 18th century, the early 1700s, called the Enclosure Acts, which took old communal land like this and divided it up, fenced it off, and then put it up for sale. They were trying to make money, and what ended up happening is people who had the money ended up buying all of the actually buying all of the fenced off land. And so a lot of the people who worked the land or lived on the land, the working class farmers, were pushed into the cities because they couldn't afford to buy the new land. They couldn't stay there. And so there's a large pool of workers in the cities to do the soon to be industrial labor. Of course, some inventions had already come about, like the flying shuttle and the spinning jenny. They had also run out of wood. They had literally depleted most of their forest supply of wood. They had used wood for fuel and for building, especially ships. And so they had to rely on coal, and there was an impetus to use more coal and develop industry around coal mining and the use of coal. Of course, Great Britain is an island, so geographically it is kind of separated from some of the conflict in Europe that stifles innovation, but also like shipping around the whole island is a lot easier, especially with infrastructure like roads and canals that have already been put in place. So it is no wonder why a lot of the industrial capacities started like the steam engine, like the railroad, stuff and stuff like that in England. We've discussed some of these inventions. I'm just going to run through them real fast. The steamship makes travel against the wind and water a lot easier, bigger, faster. Where you don't have to use sails now we can use a paddle. The cotton gin, which will make slavery more profitable. It makes the ginning, the removal of the seed from cotton, a lot easier. And then you can add a motor to it, even go faster. Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin. He's also the guy who's in charge of interchangeable parts. Instead of building one whole thing, we can build parts of things and replace them and fix them and make them a lot easier. The railroad, a depiction of the railroad here. We have a steam driven, instead of horse and buggy, now we can just go through mountains, over lakes, and we can traverse whole continents in matters of days, right? And then add on the rail cars that will be soon refrigerated, and you can carry food across the country. You can slaughter a cow in Chicago and send it to New York or LA. It's totally transforms the economics, agriculture. Now, as far as communication, things like the telegraph, the telephone, the radio, Of course, now we're able to communicate not by letter and by horse, but over vast distances in seconds, right? First by wire and then over the air. The factory system. Now, initially, of course, industry was proto-industry. It was the cottage industry where a lot of females were involved, especially at home, making home all that stuff, the textiles at home, and so not very fast, but handcrafted. Now, the idea behind these factory guys was let's put all of the means of production under one roof, and we can pump it out a lot faster and easier. And that's what happened, especially after assembly line production, where one person does one part, another person does another part. And so, under the factory system, you would see increased production, but you'd also see some bad conditions, right? And people now answer to a boss. In the cottage industry, they were in their home, they were in charge, not in the factory system. Electricity, which would we had understood electricity for some time, but it was the harnessing of electricity into the home, into appliances. That would make it so revolutionary. And then coal would be replaced in the second part of the Industrial Revolution, the second Industrial Revolution, by the discovery of petroleum in the ground, which was distilled to different fuels and for lubrication. And the second Industrial Revolution would be powered by petroleum and produce goods around that, like chemical goods, household goods, as opposed to the early Industrial Revolution that was far more in the way of textiles and coal and stuff like that. The Bessemer process of steel making. So you take iron ore, you put it in a cauldron, you boil it, you get it real hot, and then they blow hot air through it. And the iron stays behind because it's heavier, but the impurities of rock and air and stuff are blown out, and you get a stronger steel that's left behind. That's called the Bessemer process, perfected by the 1850s, though the technology, the idea had been around since like Song, China. Now you add in concrete and steel, and you're able to build high-rise buildings, skyscrapers, which take off in places like Chicago, but then soon around the world. Cities are getting bigger. We can't build out. We got to build up, right? The internal combustible engine. So the problem with the steam engine is that the fire is external and it boils water, which drives the engine. How can we put that all together? That's the combustion is internal. It's in the engine. So you get more smaller, compact, efficient engines, like the one that would be put on the first airplane. We could not power it with a steam engine, right? But if we can make an internal combustible engine, we get more dense, contained explosion that is more powerful and more efficient. The airplane, of course, will come right at the end of this unit. And now we can travel distances not only on water, but in air very fast. Absolutely insane. And then vulcanized rubber. Rubber is a sap from a tree. Without doing anything, it's not very useful. But through chemical processes and heating and cooling, you can use rubber for these new automobiles' tires. You can use them for insulators for the telegraph lines, or you can even make gloves out of them. I mean, you can do anything with rubber through vulcanization. The interchangeable parts. This is the Bessemer process right here. They're blowing the impurities out. Guglielmo Marconi, the inventor of the radio. So now we don't need wires. We can just send it over. The internal combustible engine. Alexander Graham Bell talking on the telephone. A factory, an early factory, a Lowell factory in Massachusetts. I showed you guys this in class, the earliest sound recording and the earliest video. This is the earliest picture in the a phonograph of what, like the modern MP3 player, whatever, modern iPod, right? You put vinyl on it. If you didn't see this, I'll show you later, but I know I showed this in class. All right, social impact of various economic theories. Two really took hold in this time period, 750, 1900. Free market industrialization. Let's get the market, let's get it free and untangled from government. We don't want the government involved in the economy. Let it do its thing. Versus, we want industry, but the state's going to sponsor it or control it or help it. That's called state capitalism or state-sponsored industrialization. We would call it fascism. And fascism would take off in places like Japan and Egypt and Germany, right? Keep that in mind for World War I, World War II. But free market industrialization would take place primarily in the West, England, France, United States, right? These areas in the blue. So again, two phases. 1848 is pivotal, not only because of the revolutions we've talked about there, but petroleum is starting to be used at this time. So if we could divide the Industrial Revolution into two parts, this is what it would be. We call this the first Industrial Revolution. We call this the second Industrial Revolution. Quickly, what you need to know, conditions are very poor. They're working with dangerous chemicals. They're working in dangerous conditions, long hours, little pay. You know, I mean, we're talking like 6, 7 days a week, right? They don't have health insurance. They don't have a say with their boss. They're having to just do what they can and make what they can just to survive, especially in this first part of the Industrial Revolution. A lot of this is brought on by rapid urbanization. Why are they living in squalid, cramped conditions? Because we see cities like, as you can see here, grow in 100 years by 600%. So in a century, we go from less than a million. In London, we go to 6.5 million people. That's insane, right? And so urbanization, working conditions, living conditions, really not the best during this industrial revolutionary period, especially the first part. And some people come out against this. One of these is called the Luddites. The Luddites were against the industrialization of jobs and the mechanization of jobs that had traditionally been controlled by people, literally their hands. They were losing their jobs to machines, and the Luddites were people who came out and would actually destroy machines, destroy factories, and kill people even. This lasted not a very long time, but eventually the Luddites would lose out, of course, and industrialization happened anyway. Or trade unions, which are common today. This was a pretty revolutionary idea back then. And a lot of people believed it had socialist, communist underpinnings. The idea that the working class gets together and they pool their money and resources together and elect people who can use money and resources to barter on their behalf. We call this collective bargaining in economics. And unions would fight for rights for the workers, who would fight for better working conditions, better working pay. Maybe they would initiate a strike, which is, okay, we're all not going to go to work today or this week or however, as we demand these conditions. And we were able to pull our money and resources together. We can give everyone a check during the strike, right? So just people working together to combat the excesses of capitalism, if you will. Of course, because of the poor conditions, diseases were prominent, like cholera, tuberculosis, typhoid. This is before a lot of the medical advancements that we'll see at the end of this unit. And so cholera is a disease that is in bad water that's usually contaminated with feces and urine. And so sewage control and maintenance and water sanitation, that's not happening, right? So people are dumping their chamber pots, they're going to the bathroom in these cesspits, and it's leaking into wells that they then drink out of. So cholera is very bad. Things like tuberculosis and typhoid, just from very poor working and living conditions that affect the skin, that affect the lungs. People are dying from these terrible diseases. There are advances, however. Eventually, these things would be taken care of by the end of this unit, especially after the 1848 revolutions, which a lot of these people, again, that were in these revolutionary movements were reacting to the harsh conservatism that took place at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. But we're also upset with some of the working conditions that also drove, and living conditions that also drove some of the fervor behind the revolutions. And so we did see advances. Soon governments would enact reform. They would enact working standards, pay standards, government regulation of some of these industries. But in the free market sense, we see new appliances. We see new inventions that revolutionize and make life easier. We do see medical advancements to combat the problems with disease. We see the invention of skyscrapers, the understanding of that we need to have better living conditions. So there are a lot of bad, but there's advancements too that come up to meet the bad. It is a truism that throughout world history, people have been able to combat a lot of the problems. or the bad? Let's see. Boxing. Anyway, so just keep that in mind. A lot of bad, but then good comes to fix it. That doesn't mean bad's totally done. Kind of like what we talked about in imperialism the other day. There's a lot of bad. There's still some good, though. A lot of good. There's still some bad, right? That's what good historians look for. Okay, social classes at this time. A large, poor labor base with a middle class. That is, the middle class is benefiting the most from the Industrial Revolution because they run the factories, they run the supply chains, right? They're the ones who are growing and making money. This is a move throughout, when we talk about economic world history, especially after 1450, this growing bourgeoisie, this growing middle class that control the means of production. Now, the wealthy elite still exist, right? But the land owning nobility, aristocracy, is it is losing its sway because now wealth is not tied to land. Wealth is tied to wealth production, the middle class and the capitalist system. That doesn't mean they don't lose their titles and do have sway. They certainly do. But the middle class is growing, becoming more economically potent and thus more politically important. So you can see here the revolutions in 1848 taking out throughout the continent, especially the middle in Germany and northern Italy, these industrial centers. You see this political cartoon, Death's Dispensary. So we have here a water well and all these people getting water. But look, death is dispensing the water because the water is contaminated with cholera. And so a lot of these people are dying, getting sick. They're unhealthy anyways. And so bad stomach disease like cholera can kill someone. Some economists to know. Um, Adam Smith, we discussed Adam Smith before. He wrote in 1776, Wealth of Nations. He is a free market or classical economist. And he argued that the government should not interfere in business because supply and demand are like the invisible hand. You see the depiction of the invisible hand here. That without government getting involved, move things as is desired and raise industry up and bring it down just as what's naturally intended. This is kind of opposed, not totally, but somewhat to John Stuart Mill. See, Adam Smith did not really, he was at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, but John Stuart Mill saw some of the worst parts of it. And so while he was a free market economist, he espoused an idea called liberalism that said the government should probably get involved in some regulation. And he was a member of parliament, and some of his ideas and teachings and arguments made themselves into some of the reform acts that we talked about in class. The reform acts, again, did start to regulate some industry and business. They did give some more men the right to vote, right? So again, some of this regulation in business, political activism from the liberal John Stuart Mill, we see that at the end of this unit. Another economist to know is David Ricardo, specifically his iron law of wages, which argued that businesses and employers are only going to pay as much as is necessary for them to succeed and their workers to survive. Nothing more than that. And that is true. Here's the thing. You have a small work population. Let's say we give them a higher wage. They're going to be able to make more babies, live longer. They have bigger families, right? Well, what happens? Well, then the job market swells as there's more people eventually to work. So guess what? We have to cut wages because there's more supply than demand, which eventually leads to smaller families, a smaller work population. It's an iron law of wages. It's a continual cycle. And so David Ricardo argued in this iron law of wages that it is the government should not get involved in wages because it's just a natural cycle that keeps oscillating back and forth. And here's the thing, that's still the case today. McDonald's workers fought for 15, and now there are automated machines in the, in the McDonald's lobby, and there's one counter, right? So Walmart, they fought for 15. Now you can't even check out without going to an automated machine. It's the iron law of wages. Another economist you need to know, he would style himself a scientist, not a sociologist, not economist, but that's what we consider him today. Karl Marx, you must know him. A German philosopher, if you will. He published in 1848 the Communist Manifesto. I know we've discussed this in class already, but the Communist Manifesto is a promotion of his ideas that we call socialism or communism, right? He also published Das Kapital in 1867. Well, he finished in 1894, but he worked on it with his friend that he was a roommate with, Friedrich Engels. And in these books, especially the Communist Manifesto, he outlines what we today call conflict theory, and the idea that all of history is a, a struggle between the haves and the have-nots. The haves are the bourgeoisie, the growing middle class, and the have-nots are the proletariat, the working class. And he argued that history goes through cycles of revolutions of these two, that they switch their spot. But eventually, what's going to happen is the proletariat will assume the means of production. History will cease. The revolutionary dichotomy that he puts out will stop. And there will be no need for the state. There will be no need for police. Everyone will be happy. Here's the problem that doesn't ever happen. Everything idea-wise he put forth is not true. This is called the Hegelian dialectic. The idea that there's haves, have-nots, and they are pitted against each other constantly. You can kind of see his theory of history here. He would count these conflicts that arise at these important junctions throughout history. This is where we are right now. He argued at the time. The bourgeoisie and the proletariat, right, are in conflict. This is the era of capitalism. But eventually, what's going to happen is the proletariat will rule, and there will be perfect democracy and communistic utopia, as was in the beginning of time, when society was not organized. Labor, private property, tribalism wasn't really a thing. However, he called this primitive communism. This would eventually happen as people started to accumulate wealth, and those who had wealth, food, money, whatever, didn't have to work, and they made people work for them, right? And so this is kind of what he's arguing. That will eventually come to an end. If he was true, would we see it by now? I don't know. Historians still debate this. This is still a hot topic, right? Or maybe he's not true. Who knows? Nonetheless, it has certainly shaped how we discuss politics and sociology today. Here's an excerpt from the Communist Manifesto. We communists have been reproached with the desire of abolishing the right of personally acquiring property as the fruit of a man's own labor, which property is alleged to be the groundwork of all personal freedom, activity, and independence. Hard-won, self-acquired, self-earned property. So he's like, you're blaming us for saying that we want to take property away? Do you mean the property of the petty artisan and of the small peasant, a form of property that preceded the bourgeois form? So he's saying, what property do you mean? Do you mean back when it was far more equal, and the artisan at home, the cottage industry, and the peasant on the farm, they had property, didn't they? There's no need to abolish that. The development of industry has to a great extent already destroyed it, and is still destroying it daily. So he's saying, you blame us for shutting down property. It was in the industrialization that really shut it down, because the peasant and the artisan, they don't have a job. They're stuck in the factory and in a crappy apartment in the big cities, right? I don't know. I don't know what to tell you, kids. No, I do. He was wrong. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the modern financial industry. Some big moves you need to know. States like England had central banks, but really, especially after the French Revolution, other states are going to establish large central banks from which they regulate commerce and they control the money supply. We'll also see at this time a big growth, not in joint stock companies. That was the progenitor of the modern corporation. Limited liability corporations, LLCs. Very similar to joint stock companies in many ways, though far larger and a bigger fist, a lot more money and property. Stock exchanges. Of course, with the advent of modern technology and economics, communication technology, we are able to trade stocks in real time, London and New York, right? And what eventually happens is you can buy parts of these large corporations, give them more money, and then maybe reap some of the profits. That's the idea behind it anyway. We'll also see the beginning of the modern insurance industry. The idea is that people have so much wealth that they need it protected. And if they give a little of it up to an insurance company, if something bad were to happen, they will get some money back, right? Very simply, think about car insurance. You pay so much a month, but hopefully, in the event of a wreck, they'll pay out for you to help you buy a new car or buy one again, right? Now, one of the primary economic debates that's taking place around the world at this time is what should our money be tied to? Of course, you have a piece of paper and coins. Today, the piece of paper is literally just that, and the coins are zinc. It's a very not very expensive metal. But they used to be made out of gold and silver. And the money used to be tied to a literal dollar's worth of gold or silver. And so a lot of the countries had used silver. Remember, we were talking about the mining of silver and how it was initial boost, but to countries like China and Spain, it caused bad inflation, the Ottoman Empire as well. And so the argument is, well, to help stave off inflation, we should tie our money to gold. It should be a gold standard. Well, here's the problem. There's a lot less gold, and gold is way more expensive than silver, though they are both precious metals. If we were to tie our money to gold, that would cause deflation, the opposite of inflation. There's less money, and so money is worth more. People who credit money, who hand out money, are all about that. However, those who have to make money to pay off debt are not about deflation, right? And so there's a big debate. It goes all over the world. Some of you have taken U.S. history. This was especially prominent near the end of this unit in U.S. history. It's really the working class, the farmers, the proletariat who are more on the silver standard. More silver, silver's cheaper, inflation. But it's those who are the banking class, this business class, who want gold, the gold standard. Some countries would go to bimetallism. They would use aspects of both, silver and gold. Some countries would go gold, some would go silver, some stayed silver. How is this important to world history? Well, it is at this time of extreme hyperglobalism that is beginning. That you would see some countries start to vastly affect the economies of others by just their decisions. One example that you need to know is in Germany, 1871, Germany unifies all of these different states that had used different things, silver, silver and gold. They get together, a new massive major industrial economy on the continent, Germany. They decide that they're going to go the gold standard. They're going to go gold. Well, this massively devalues what silver that they had and that others had through Germany. And so this causes what we call the Panic of 1873. A lot of people lose their butt because Germany had been on silver, then goes gold. So a lot of places that had been on silver, their silver is now devalued because this massive player, the new unified powerful Germany, is no longer on silver. So what's silver worth? So it especially hits Europe. It also hits other places like the United States, right? And this causes a 15-year depression called the Long Depression, which ends about 1898. And it's during this time we see places. Do we stay on silver? Do we go to gold? Do we do both? Right? And so that's the debate over the gold standard. Just understand that it was taking place and how one place, Germany, deciding to go gold can mess up the world. That's the Panic of 1873, the Long Depression that happened afterwards. We'll also see the rise of transnational businesses. These are businesses that are focused in one place but do the work in another country. The Suez Canal Company, which builds the Suez Canal in Egypt, is out of France. The Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Company, this is in your CED, the Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Company, is based out of London, but they operate in Hong Kong, which is an island that China gives up to Great Britain, and Shanghai, a city where they had a lot of economic concessions, thus the name. And this is a major banking company and lending company. It still exists today. It's a major financial player. Unilever, which is also in your CED. Unilever is a Dutch British company that they still exist today, and they make all sorts of home goods, but they were formed from a palm oil company, the Lever Brothers, and a margarine company. And so they were operating in Dutch and in the Netherlands and England, though they were farming palm oil in West Africa or making margarine from vegetable oil in the Dutch East Indies. And so, again, a major, large transnational company. And the United Fruit Company, which was based out of the United States, but operated monoculture plantations throughout Latin America. And all of these companies are doing, operating in a system that economists and historians call economic imperialism. They're very wealthy and they're powerful back at home. So when they go and they operate in these poor and not as developed places, they run the show. And so, yes, in the United Fruit Company, this fruit company that's operating out of the United States that is using places like Nicaragua as literally large plantations for bananas. The United States doesn't control Nicaragua. It's totally independent, right? But in reality, the United Fruit Company does, because the leaders there that are independent, they're in the pockets of the fruit company that give them cutbacks. The workers there, they all work on these large plantations, right? And it's the same thing with all of these companies, right? This is economic imperialism. It's not imperialism by gun, but by dollar. And so in the United Fruit Company, they do fruits like pineapples and bananas. And so they actually grow a lot of these that do well in these tropic places and send them back to the United States, who they've never had pineapples or bananas before. And they make a lot of money off of this. And that's exactly what it is. I mean, they are operating in these places. See if I can go back. Yep. Like the United States. And I mean, they make a lot of money off tourism, off work. It's just it's a business, but it's like nothing we've ever seen before. And they're effectively running these places. That's economic imperialism. Boston to Jamaica, the United Fruit Company, they have their own steamship line, right? Now, you saw that picture before. I don't know if I can go back to it. I don't, I think I've messed up somehow. Let me see what I can do here. Yeah. Before, you would have saw some guys who were staying on an island. They were mining guano. Guano is bird and bat poop that is very nitrogen and ammonia rich. And what they use it for all sorts of stuff, but you need to know they use guano for growing agriculture industry. It's an important fertilizer. We find that we can actually put it on fields and it makes those fields produce a lot better. And so they are mining guano all over these islands in the Caribbean and Pacific, but especially in Latin America, right? Places like Peru and Argentina and Chile have a lot of guano activity going on there. But just some places that the United Fruit Company was operating in. You see that star? That's actually U.S. Naval Base in Guantanamo Bay, which they get from Spain after the Spanish-American War of 1898. So here's the thing. Again, the United States is not controlling these places, but the United Fruit Company is. And the United States is more than willing to back them up with their new gunboats called the Dreadnought and the pre-Dreadnought ship. Historians sometimes call this gunboat diplomacy, where the United States is going to protect economic interest, make sure that Americans and the business there stay safe, and they'll pull up to the harbor with all these battleships and stuff just as a show of force. Hey, don't get too out of hand, or we're going to have to go to war, right? Just stuff like that. And this happened in Hawaii. This happened in Cuba, famously, the USS Maine, an example of gunboat diplomacy. But the problem with the Maine was it exploded and people died. And so the United States ends up going to war in Cuba. Gunboat diplomacy, the United Fruit Company, economic imperialism. You got to know it. Let's look at Japan. Japan, of course, an example of state-sponsored industry, and they called these large state-sponsored businesses Zaibatsu, which were funded, regulated, and in bed, in cahoots with the government. A lot of these still exist today. Some of these companies, Toshiba, Toyota, Yamaha, they started as Zaibatsu, as government-run businesses, industry. That's why they produced the stuff they did. Things like Mitsubishi was in charge of engines and stuff like that. and eventually airplanes and other mechanics. The government said, we need to get our industry going. So they would give it to this guy, his name Mitsubishi, and they said, whatever you need, just make this, just make what we want from you. We'll give you all the, you have all the reign. You answer to the government only, though. And so, like when you guys read the reading on early industry in Japan, a lot of those were not Zaibatsu, but then eventually they would become Zaibatsu. You know, there may have been a couple of early automobile manufacturers that were conglomerated forcibly by the government under Toyota or Nissan, right? And there is a dreadnought battleship, as we were talking about gunboat diplomacy, these new all steel battleships with huge guns, totally changing warfare and diplomacy. And so the United States, it's banana republic, economic imperialism, but also Great Britain, right? Throughout Africa, the Dutch in uh, the Dutch East Indies, the United States and the Philippines. So Hong Kong, Shanghai banking up British East India, France and Algeria. The British will build a large port at Buenos Aires. It's still the capital of Argentina, but like the port there and the city there, they financed from like 1880 to 1920 with their money. Again, economic imperialism. No, we don't own you, but we did build that big city of yours. So throughout Africa, Russia and East Siberia still instituting the Yasak form of economic imperialism here. Japan will eventually end up owning like Korea and Taiwan. It is during this period that Britain shows up in Australia, New Zealand, France, and Vietnam. So look this political cartoon of economic imperialism. You see the United States starting off as a little baby right after the revolution, but by this time it's gotten fat and it's got that big cigar. It kind of looks like a big fat businessman, right? And look, he gets whatever he wants, and all the people of the world reach out to him. Oh, give us some of your valuable colonies, give us some of your resources. But he's just in big fat. He's gone from his young Republican Democratic days. Now he's like a colonial power. And look how he's able to get at that big old battleship, right? That gunboat diplomacy. That was Uncle Sam, by the way. Remember, Uncle Sam is typically a depiction of the United States, especially after at the end of this unit and after. And he kind of looks like these big bosses of industry, right? So here's a depiction of the United States Senate. And you have here the senators, look, they're doing their work, but who is looking over them? The Steel Beam Trust, the Copper Trust, Standard Oil, iron, coal, the nails, these guys who run the show, who are the economic players, they really are actually running the show, right? These guys get to vote, but who do they answer to? Who are they paid for? Economic imperialism, even at home. So the idea is that government and industry are in bed together. This free market industry, oh yeah, how free market is it? If the government doesn't regulate it, the economy regulates the government. So there's a problem there. Now, outside the West, there was some success and some failures. Of course, the Meiji Restoration was very successful in industrializing. We saw examples of that in Zaibatsu, but it's a very top-down approach. The Meiji Emperor said, we are going to do this. We are going to build battleships. We are going to build guns. We are going to have modern infrastructure like roads, telegraphs. And it was madly successful. You see here a depiction of women working in a modern textile factory where they're finishing up some clothes here. But in places like the Ottoman Empire and Qing China, it did not work. The Ottoman Empire's Tanzimat reforms were stifled by a large contingent of Islamist fundamentalists who did not want to see advancement. And the self-strengthening movement in China did bring, and the Tanzimat reforms did bring some stuff. That was in the first video we watched. And the self-strengthening movement did bring some moderate economic and military advancement to China, but too little too late. Notably in the Tanzimat reform, but especially in the self-strengthening movement in China, social change failed to happen. We'll see in Japan, like people would start dressing up like Europeans. Look at them. They adopted the European ways, Western ways. And so when Europeans show up there and start doing business with them, it's like, well, we're kind of the same, I guess. I mean, certainly there were still racial aspects, but compared to China and the Ottoman Empire, they fell into decline because of their failure to get on board, right? Okay, and that is it. Uh, that's all I got. That's just a really brief. Make sure you read. Make sure you listen to the economic section. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll be putting out some more videos here soon enough.